My name is Claire Dawson. I am 32 years old, and on New Year's Eve I drove 7 hours back to my parents' house in Sacramento. The street was glowing with holiday lights, neighbors laughing, sparklers going off in the cold night air. For a moment, I wanted to believe I was coming home to warmth. But the second I stepped through that old green door, something inside me tightened. The air smelled of cinnamon and pine, the fire crackled, yet I felt like a stranger standing in my own childhood home. Then my eyes landed on the mantel, and everything inside me froze. The family photo that once showed all of us together was there, but my place in it had been cut out, a raw white hole where my face should have been. No one said a word, they just smiled and carried on as if nothing had changed. Have you ever been erased so carefully you almost believed it yourself? Stay with me, because what followed after that night turned a silent cutout into a revelation that shook my entire family. Let me take you back to where it began. The cold that night felt sharper than I remembered as I pulled my car into the narrow driveway of my parents' house in Sacramento. I had driven 7 hours from Denver, through patches of snow and rain, the radio fading in and out with static, and by the time I arrived, the street was glowing with holiday lights. The neighbors had strung bulbs across their porches, and someone down the block was setting off sparklers early, their crackle echoing in the dark. I sat in my car for a moment with the engine off, watching the house I had grown up in. The roofline was outlined with twinkling icicles, the porch light burned a steady yellow, and for 1 second it looked like something out of a holiday movie. Only my chest felt tight, and I knew I wasn't stepping into a story where everyone would be waiting with open arms. I forced myself out of the car, boots crunching against the thin sheet of ice on the walkway. My breath puffed white as I climbed the porch steps. The wooden door looked the same, faded green paint, peeling near the handle, but when I pushed it open and heard the familiar creak, I felt like an outsider trespassing. Warmth from the fireplace rolled toward me, carrying the scent of cinnamon nutmeg and the faint sweetness of Linda's gingerbread cookies. For a heartbeat, I thought maybe I had exaggerated things. Maybe I would walk in and find some trace of home again. Then my eyes landed on the mantel above the fireplace. The frame was mahogany, polished to a shine, holding a glossy photograph blown up larger than life. In it stood Richard, my father, tall in his blazer, hand on Eric's shoulder. Beside him, Linda leaned close, smiling in her ivory sweater. Eric, my younger brother, had that playful grin he always flashed at the camera. And right where I used to be between them, or at least in the frame somewhere, was nothing. Worse than nothing. My face had been cut out. A jagged oval of white paper showed where scissors had been. Not a blurred crop, not a missing snapshot, but a deliberate removal. I stopped in the doorway, the draft from outside still clinging to my coat. The sound of laughter floated from the dining room chairs, scraping the clink of glasses. No one had noticed me yet. My pulse throbbed in my throat as I stared at the empty space in the photo. They hadn't just forgotten to include me, they had erased me. I closed the door, softly hung my coat on the hook, and brushed snow from my boots, trying to steady my breathing. Linda's voice floated out from the kitchen, sweet as honey. "Claire, you made it. I'm making your favorite chicken stew." Her tone didn't falter, not a word about the weather or the drive, not a single hesitation that I might have seen the photo glaring at me from across the room. Richard came down the stairs just then, holding a glass of wine. His salt and pepper hair was combed back neatly, his expression unreadable. "Claire, you look good," he said, as if he were greeting a colleague at a conference. "What have you been up to?" I smiled faintly. "Managing," I said, my voice quiet, then stepped into the living room. Eric was sprawled across the sofa, phone in hand, tapping away with the confidence of someone who had never been left out of anything. He glanced up, gave me a quick nod, and muttered, "You're here. Thought maybe you weren't coming." I sat in the armchair across from him and answered, "I used to think that too." He didn't look up again. The table nearby was covered with neatly wrapped presents tags, handwritten in Linda's elegant script. Dad's, Mom's, Eric's. Not a single one with my name. My eyes traveled to the Christmas tree decorated with shining glass ornaments, ribbons, and strands of white lights. Missing were the handmade trinkets I had crafted as a child, the glittery stars and painted pine cones. It was as if someone had carefully cleared every trace of me out of the picture. Linda bustled out of the kitchen apron, dusted in flour, her cheeks rosy from the oven heat. "Dinner's almost ready. Is everyone hungry?" She beamed at us, wiping her hands on a dish towel. I opened my mouth to ask about the photograph, about the ornaments, but the words stuck. I could already hear her laugh, light and dismissive, telling me I was being too sensitive, that it didn't mean anything. I didn't have the strength for that answer. The house hummed with cheer, but under it I felt the hollow beat of exclusion. Richard adjusted his glasses and took a sip of wine, his attention already drifting back to his phone. Eric chuckled at something on the screen, sharing it with no one. Linda went back to the kitchen, humming softly to the tune of a carol playing from a speaker. I sat there, hands clenched in my lap, listening to the sounds of a family that had learned to keep moving without me. My gaze returned to the mantel, to that empty cutout where my face had been, the edges still sharp, proof of how deliberate it was. The warmth of the fire licked at my skin, but I shivered all the same. I thought about the drive, the hours on the road, replaying conversations I might have with them, hoping for even a sliver of acknowledgement. But now, staring at the photo, I realized there was nothing left to ask. Linda's voice called again from the kitchen, bright and effortless. "Claire, set your bag down, we'll eat soon." I rose slowly, placed my overnight bag by the stairs, and returned to the living room. My eyes drifted once more to the cutout, then to the tidy stack of gifts on the table. I lowered myself into the armchair again, keeping my face calm, though my chest burned with unspoken words. Eric finally glanced at me, his eyes lingering just long enough to show curiosity before he turned back to his phone. The silence stretched. I folded my hands, forcing a steady breath, and decided to wait. Something inside me told me this wasn't the moment to confront them. Not yet. The fire crackled, sparks rising in the chimney, while outside the new year waited to begin. Linda's voice floated in from the kitchen again, cheerful and clear, telling us to wash up because dinner was ready. The sound of bowls clinking against the counter, mixed with the faint music from the small Bluetooth speaker she always used during the holidays. I stood reluctantly, smoothing down my sweater, as if that would help me blend in better at a table where I no longer felt like I belonged. The dining room was warm, lit by the chandelier that had been hanging there since I was a child. The table was dressed in a red and white cloth, the same one Linda used every year, and the smell of roasted chicken stew filled the air. I pulled out a chair quietly, while Richard took the head of the table, and Eric plopped down at his usual spot, stretching his arms, as if he owned the room. Linda came in with a large pot, her face glowing, and set it in the middle with a proud flourish. She looked around, smiling her eyes, stopping briefly on me before shifting quickly back to Eric. She asked him about his work, and that was all it took. He launched into a long explanation about his latest project in Los Angeles, describing every detail of the design he was preparing for a restaurant chain, how the lighting would transform the entire space, how the client loved his creativity. Richard leaned in with interest, nodding at every sentence, his brow furrowed in admiration. "That is impressive," he said. "I knew you had a good eye for this." Linda clasped her hands together, adding, "You always had a special touch, Eric, even when you repainted your bedroom back in high school. No one wanted to change it afterward because you made it perfect." I spooned some stew into my bowl, listening as my own presence faded into the background. I tried to think of something to say, some way to join the conversation, but each time I opened my mouth, Eric's voice filled the air again. He spoke with the confidence of someone who knew the spotlight was permanently fixed on him. Finally, I asked softly, "How long will you be in Los Angeles this time?" Eric gave me a quick glance, then shrugged. "Probably until February. After that, maybe Tokyo. They want me to help with another concept there." He went back to his food without a question in return. The rest of the meal was more of the same. Linda leaned toward Eric, asking about the people he worked with, whether they were impressed by his ideas. Richard nodded along occasionally, adding a memory about how Eric had always been inventive as a child. My spoon stirred the stew in slow circles, my appetite gone. I glanced around the table, the candles flickering in their holders, shadows playing on the walls. I remembered when I was a little girl sitting at this same table blurting out stories about school projects, and Linda would gently hush me so Richard could ask Eric about his day. That pattern had never changed. Richard raised his glass suddenly. To Eric for making us proud. Linda clinked her water glass against his. Eric lifted his with a grin. I hesitated, but lifted mine too, though my lips didn't move around the word proud. The silence after the toast left me raw. I let my eyes wander past Richard's shoulder back into the living room where the photo frame caught the light from the fire. The empty space where my face should have been seemed to gleam brighter than anything else in the room. The stew cooled in front of me, barely touched. Linda's voice broke through again, lilting, telling Eric she had saved the best gingerbread cookies for him because she knew how much he loved them. Eric laughed, reaching for another spoonful of stew, his phone buzzing at the edge of the table. I pressed my hands together under the table, forcing them still. The conversation kept flowing over me about clients' travel opportunities, the proud rhythm of a family, in sync with one person's future. My future didn't exist here. Not in their voices, not in the photo on the mantel, not even in the pile of presents waiting in the corner. When Linda finally turned to me, it was to ask if I wanted more stew. I smiled politely and said no, my bowl was fine. She nodded and went back to slicing bread. The rest of the dinner blurred together. Eric talked, Richard admired, Linda fussed. I sat listening, the warmth of the food and the fire, unable to melt the frost that had settled deep inside me. By the time dessert was brought out, I knew nothing I said would shift the evening. The cutout photo lingered in my mind like a shadow, reminding me of what had been done in silence. I folded my napkin, set it on the table, and leaned back in my chair. The sound of Eric's laughter echoed around the room, but my eyes stayed on the flickering light, spilling from the living room, waiting for what I already knew would come later that night. After the plates were cleared, Linda disappeared into the living room, carrying a stack of wrapped gifts, her face glowing with the same excitement she always had during these moments. The tree sparkled behind her lights, twinkling ornaments glinting the room, arranged like a holiday advertisement. Richard followed, carrying 2 smaller boxes, and Eric trailed along, phone in one hand, smirk already in place. I moved slower, feeling the weight of the evening pressing on me, though I knew I had no choice but to sit and play my part. Linda set the gifts in neat piles on the coffee table, her handwriting looping elegantly across each tag. Richard reached for one marked Eric, handing it to him with the pride of a father who believed this ritual defined love. Eric tore the paper quickly, the sound of ripping filling the room, and inside was a sleek black box. He opened it and gasped in delight, holding up a silver Rolex with a leather strap, the kind I had once seen displayed under glass in an airport shop. "You remembered," he said, grinning wide. Linda clasped her hands together, beaming, her voice trembling with joy. "Your father ordered it back in June as soon as you mentioned it. We wanted you to have something timeless, something worthy of your talent." Richard nodded, his eyes locked on Eric, his smile faint but proud. Eric slipped the watch on his wrist, immediately holding his arm out so the light could catch the polished surface. He looked every bit like the chosen one in a story scripted for him. I lowered my gaze, pretending to admire the tree. I could feel the heat rising in my face, not from envy, but from the sharp sting of recognition. The contrast between what he received and what I knew would come for me was too obvious. Linda reached for a smaller package, sliding it across the table toward me. I forced a smile, peeling back the paper carefully, not wanting to draw attention. Inside was a folded scarf, pale gray, soft but thin, the kind you would find on sale in a discount bin. A small card slipped out, handwritten with Linda's cursive. "To my strong daughter." I touched the letters with my fingertip, my throat tight. "It is pretty," I said, softly, placing the scarf back in the box. Linda smiled quickly, already turning to Eric. "Do you like the fit?" she asked, pointing at the Rolex. Eric laughed, saying it was perfect, adjusting the strap while Richard watched proudly. I folded the tissue paper over the scarf, the card resting on top like a cruel joke. Strong, they called me, as if strength was a reason to give less, to expect less, to love less. My mind wandered back to college, those long nights working behind a supermarket counter stocking shelves until 2 in the morning, just so I could afford books. I remembered copying chapters by hand because I couldn't buy the texts outright. I never asked for help because deep down I knew the answer would be silence. At the same time, Eric was celebrating his acceptance into Cal State Long Beach, with a backyard party, fairy lights strung across the fence, a 3-tier cake set on a decorated table, and applause that echoed long into the night. When my acceptance letter came for business school, I received a polite hug and a reminder to save money. That was all. The memories pressed down on me, making the room smaller, the laughter louder, the distance deeper. Richard leaned forward now, asking Eric about his upcoming trip to New York, how long he would stay, whether the firm appreciated his ideas. Eric answered with the enthusiasm of someone who had never been questioned. I sat in silence, the scarf still in my lap. My chest ached, but my face remained composed, a mask I had learned to wear from years of practice. Linda brought out another box for Eric, this one from Richard. Inside was a tailored jacket, the kind that made him look like he belonged in glossy magazines. They laughed together and Eric tried it on right away, turning toward the mirror with admiration. Finally, Linda returned with one last gift for me, a small paper bag with a ribbon tied loosely at the top. I opened it slowly, revealing a plain ceramic mug. Across the front, in bold black letters, it read "Special Daughter." I turned it in my hands, running my thumb across the words. Linda chuckled lightly. "The second I saw it, I thought of you." The mug felt heavy, though not in weight. I nodded politely, setting it back in the bag. The phrase "Special Daughter" rang hollow, almost mocking, when set against the Rolex gleaming on Eric's wrist and the jacket now hanging neatly on the chair. Richard clapped Eric on the back, Linda wiped a tear of joy from her eye, and Eric laughed again, basking in the glow that had never dimmed for him. I sat quietly, my gifts tucked close, symbols of the space I had always occupied, present but invisible, strong but unworthy of celebration. The fire crackled in the background, shadows dancing across the walls, the air thick with cinnamon and pine. My eyes strayed once more to the mantel, to the family photo where my face had been cut out, and the irony made my stomach tighten. Not only was I erased from their memory, but the little they gave me now only underscored the truth. I lifted the mug again, staring at the words, letting them blur. My heart thudded not with anger, but with a strange clarity. I was done hoping for change in this house. I set the mug carefully on the table, folded the scarf neatly back into its box, and leaned into the armchair, listening as their laughter rose and fell like a tide I was never meant to swim in. When the laughter quieted and the gifts were stacked neatly by the tree, I slipped out onto the porch. The cold hit me instantly, sharp and bracing, but it felt cleaner than the heavy air inside. Snow drifted down in slow flakes, settling on the railing, clinging to the sleeves of my sweater. I leaned against the post, drawing in a deep breath, and let my mind wander to years I had tried to forget. I was 16 again, lying in bed with a fever that shook my body so hard I could barely lift my head. The room spun each time I opened my eyes. I remember clutching the phone, calling out for Linda, my voice hoarse. She came in, perfume clinging to her clothes, and told me she was already late to take Eric to his art competition. Could I wait until the weekend to see a doctor? I nodded, even though my head pounded. She pressed a cool towel to my forehead and kissed Eric on the cheek before hurrying him out the door with his sketchbooks. I listened to the car pull away while sweat soaked my pillow. By the time she returned, hours later, Eric had won a ribbon. He burst into my room, excited, waving it in the air. Linda smiled proudly, telling him he was destined for greatness. I smiled weakly, even as my body shook with chills. That night I convinced myself I was strong enough to manage. I always told myself that. The memory faded as I stared across the quiet street. Houses glowed with strings of lights, and I wondered how many kids inside were being fussed over by parents. How many had their faces centered proudly in photos above fireplaces. The door creaked behind me, and Richard stepped out holding his wineglass, his breath fogging in the cold. He looked at me briefly, then turned his eyes to the yard. "Cold night," he muttered. I gave a small nod. The silence between us stretched heavy and awkward. I wanted to ask him if he knew how much I had endured alone, if he ever thought about the times I had gone without, while he poured everything into Eric. But his face was blank, his gaze distant. He took a sip of wine and said, "You've always been the tough one, Claire. I knew you would be fine, that was all." He patted my shoulder stiffly and went back inside, shutting the door softly behind him. I stood frozen, the words digging deeper than the cold. Tough, fine. The labels they had given me to excuse every absence, every neglect. They had turned my resilience into permission to forget me. Snowflakes landed on my eyelashes, melted into tiny drops, and I let the chills sting my skin. I thought of all the times I had swallowed disappointment, convinced myself it was enough to simply endure. Each moment stacked on top of the other until I could barely tell where strength ended and loneliness began. A car rolled slowly down the street, tires crunching softly on ice, its headlights sweeping across the porch. I stepped back inside, the warmth pressing against me again, but it no longer felt like comfort. The house smelled of pine and cinnamon, but underneath was the stale weight of old patterns that never shifted. Eric was stretched out on the couch, watch glittering on his wrist, telling Linda about a gallery opening he wanted to attend in Manhattan. She listened intently, her hand resting on his knee. Richard sank into his chair, scrolling on his phone. No one looked at me as I passed through the room. I climbed the stairs slowly, the muffled voices fading behind me. My old bedroom door was open, but the space had been cleared, boxes stacked high, a folded ironing board leaning against the wall. The daisy print sheets I had once loved were long gone. It smelled like dust and mothballs. Linda's voice floated up from downstairs. "You'll be sleeping in the guest room tonight, honey." I stepped into the narrow hall, my hand brushing against the faded wallpaper, and pushed open the door to the guest room. A small bed sat against the wall sheets, thin, a flickering nightlight in the corner. I set my overnight bag down and sat on the edge of the mattress. The springs sagged beneath me. My scarf was still around my neck, and I didn't bother taking it off. The sounds of laughter drifted faintly up the stairs, muffled but sharp enough to pierce the thin walls. I pressed my palms together and closed my eyes. For years I had told myself these memories did not define me. That being overlooked only made me stronger. But sitting there in that dim room, I finally admitted what I had known all along. Being forgotten had carved a hollow space inside me that no amount of strength could fill. The wind rattled the window frame, and I lay back staring at the cracked ceiling. In my coat pocket, the thick envelope rested like a weight I could not ignore. I reached for it, ran my hand along the edge of the paper, and whispered to myself that soon they would see. My eyes burned, though no tears fell. The night stretched on, filled with footsteps downstairs, the scrape of a chair, the sound of Eric laughing at something on his phone. I lay still, listening, waiting, letting the bitterness settle into something steadier. When the house finally quieted, I turned onto my side, the envelope pressed against my chest. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it carried with it the image of the cutout photo above the fireplace, its empty space staring back at me, daring me to reclaim the place they had tried to erase. Morning light crept through the blinds of the guest room, pale and cold against the thin sheets. I sat up slowly, my body stiff from the restless night, the envelope still tucked deep in my coat pocket where I had left it. The house below stirred with the faint hum of a coffee maker, the scrape of chairs against the kitchen floor, and Linda's familiar humming. I dressed quickly, slipping on a sweater and jeans, then went downstairs with my steps light, almost hesitant. The kitchen smelled of waffles and scrambled eggs, the same routine Linda had perfected for years. She was at the stove, hair pinned neatly back, her coral lipstick fresh even this early. Richard sat at the table scrolling through his phone, a steaming mug of coffee beside him. Eric lounged in his chair talking about the calls he needed to make later, his voice steady and confident. No one looked up when I entered, and for a moment I stood there invisible in my own home. I poured myself coffee, the bitter scent filling the air, and took a seat at the far end of the table. Linda turned briefly and smiled, asking if I had slept well. I gave a small nod, though my eyes lingered on the living room, where the photograph still hung its hollow space, unchanged, mocking me in daylight. Breakfast passed with more of the same. Eric spoke about his new design project in New York and how the client wanted to fly him out again in February. Linda leaned forward, glowing with pride, and Richard chimed in with his steady nods of approval. I ate quietly, the taste of waffles flat in my mouth, my thoughts elsewhere. When the meal ended, I slipped outside for a moment of fresh air. The neighborhood was still dusted in snow, children dragging sleds down the sidewalk, their laughter echoing across the quiet street. As I stood on the porch, adjusting my scarf, the screen door next door squeaked open, and Alice Green stepped out, her arms full of groceries. She spotted me instantly, her face lighting up with recognition. "Claire Dawson," she said warmly, walking closer. "I have not seen you in years." I smiled, faintly grateful for her familiar voice. "It has been a while," I admitted. She set the bags down on her porch rail and tilted her head, studying me. "You know, your grandfather Henry used to tell me often how proud he was of you. He would say, 'One day Claire will carry this family forward. She has the strength.'" Her words hit me harder than she could know. I swallowed, unsure of what to say. She went on, her voice softer. "I remember him standing out here talking about that house on Brookfield Street. He always said it would be yours someday." My stomach twisted. Brookfield Street. I hadn't heard that address in years. I nodded, forcing my voice steady. "He really said that." Alice smiled and picked up her bags again. "He was a good man. He wanted to make sure you had something lasting." With that, she shuffled back toward her door, waving once more before disappearing inside. I stood frozen, her words circling in my mind. Brookfield Street. I remembered being told after Henry's funeral in 2016 that there was nothing left but a little money for expenses, that Richard had handled all the paperwork. I never questioned it, never thought to look deeper. Snowflakes began to fall again, brushing against my hair, but I barely felt them. The memory of my grandfather's hand on my shoulder surfaced, his quiet laugh, the way he used to let me sit beside him in his workshop while he sanded wood. He had always made me feel seen, even when no one else did. I walked back inside, my heart pounding in my ears. Linda was wiping down the counter, Richard still buried in his phone, Eric gathering his things for a call. None of them noticed the shift in me, the way my chest burned with suspicion, now the way my hand itched toward the envelope still waiting in my pocket. I excused myself and went upstairs, closing the guest room door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, pulled the envelope free, and placed it on my lap. The weight of it felt heavier than ever. Alice's words had unlocked something I had tried to ignore, and now the truth was clawing its way forward. I traced the edge of the envelope with my finger, thinking about all the years I had struggled, all the times I had convinced myself I was fine, while they poured everything into Eric. What if there had been something meant for me all along? What if my grandfather had tried to leave me more than just memories? The night before, the photo with my cutout face had ripped open an old wound, but now Alice's reminder had turned that wound into resolve. I would not let them keep me invisible forever. I lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, and let the sounds of the house drift up through the floorboards. The laughter, the conversations, the steady rhythm of life that had always moved without me. My hand rested on the envelope, steady and firm. For the first time in years, I felt something shift inside, not the ache of being left out, not the longing for scraps of attention, but the sharp edge of certainty. Soon they would see what I carried. Soon they would have to face what they had tried so hard to hide. It had been 3 months earlier on a bright September morning when everything began to unravel. I had taken the day off work in Denver to drive down to Fremont County, planning nothing more than a quick errand at the administrative office. My company, Frontline Logistics, needed a certified residency document for my new role, and I thought it would be simple. The office smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the kind of place where time felt slow. The woman at the counter wore reading glasses on a chain, her gray hair tied back in a bun. She typed my name into her computer, then paused. "You're Claire Dawson, born July 18th, 1992. I nodded, thinking nothing of it. She squinted at the screen and asked if I was still the property owner at 2185 Brookfield Street. My chest tightened. I blinked and leaned closer. "I am sorry, what did you say?" Her voice was calm, steady. "It shows here that you are listed as the current owner of that property. It was transferred to your name in 2016 from Henry Dawson." I stood frozen, gripping the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. Henry Dawson was my grandfather. He had died in 2016, the year I was told he left behind almost nothing. My parents had handled all the paperwork back then. I remembered Richard explaining it clearly, saying there was only a small amount of cash for funeral costs and that the rest had been taken care of. I never questioned him. I left the office in a haze, the document I came for forgotten in my hand. My car sat baking in the late summer sun, and I sat inside gripping the wheel trying to make sense of what I had just heard. That evening, I searched property records online, fingers trembling on the keyboard. Line after line confirmed the same thing. The triplex on Brookfield Street had been under my name for years. Tax filings, ownership transfers, legal documents all spelled it out, yet I had never seen a dime from it. Never even knew it still existed. I hired a lawyer within a week. His name was Mark Reynolds, a steady man in his mid-40s with calm eyes and a firm handshake. We sat in his office, surrounded by shelves of thick legal books, the blinds half drawn against the afternoon glare. I explained everything, the story tumbling out of me, and he listened carefully, jotting notes. When I finished, he slid a folder across the desk. Inside were certified copies of Henry's will. My eyes burned as I read the words written in black ink. I leave full ownership of the property at 2185 Brookfield Street to my granddaughter Claire Dawson. No conditions. No intermediaries. My throat tightened. Mark explained how the will had been filed properly, notarized, witnessed, indisputable in court. Yet somehow, after Henry's death, my parents had stepped in, continued collecting rent signing agreements, with tenants pocketing the income as if it belonged to them. They had even raised the rent twice, records showed, making themselves steady money for 7 years. I thought back to my college days, the nights I survived on instant noodles, the weeks I went without proper textbooks, the months I worked 2 jobs just to pay for gas. Meanwhile, they were collecting steady rental checks in my name, funding Eric's tuition, financing vacations to Palm Springs, and maintaining the condo Linda loved, showing off. The rage I expected never came. Instead, I felt a cold clarity settling into my chest, a kind of calm that came when truth could no longer be denied. Mark gathered documents for me, pages thick with evidence stamped and signed. He told me if I wanted to reclaim full control, I had every right. The law was on my side. He also warned me that confronting my parents might not bring the answers I hoped for. It would likely bring denial, excuses, maybe even anger. I nodded, sliding the papers back into the thick envelope he prepared for me. I carried it home like it was an anchor holding me steady. From that day forward, I kept the envelope close. Sometimes in my work bag, sometimes in my coat pocket, always within reach. It became the proof I needed that my life was not built on imagination or sensitivity, but on facts they could not erase. Back in Sacramento now, the envelope sat under my pillow, its presence as constant as the silence between me and my family. Every smile from Linda, every proud glance toward Eric, every word Richard muttered while staring at his phone only added weight to what I carried. I could see it so clearly. The glossy watch on Eric's wrist, the jacket hanging neatly on the chair, the mug in my hands that read Special Daughter. All of it was funded by money that had been mine. The house creaked as footsteps moved down the hall. I slid the envelope back into my coat pocket, heart racing, though no one was near. The truth was mine now. The question was when to let them see it. I walked to the window, peering out at the quiet street, dusted with fresh snow. The maple tree in the front yard swayed gently in the wind, its branches bare. I remembered Henry standing there years ago, his hand resting on my shoulder, telling me that one day I would have something lasting to call my own. I whispered his words under my breath, steadying myself. The time was coming. Soon they would know what he had left me, what they had tried to take away. The sound of laughter drifted from downstairs, Eric's voice booming with confidence, as Linda encouraged him, Richard chiming in with quiet approval. I clenched my fists, the edges of the envelope pressing against my ribs like a reminder. I sat on the bed, back straight, staring at the door. Tomorrow was New Year's Day. Tomorrow the envelope would leave my pocket and land on the table where they could no longer pretend I did not exist. The guest room was dim, except for the nightlight flickering in the corner, casting a weak orange glow against the wall. I sat on the edge of the bed, my coat still draped over my shoulders, the envelope tucked securely in the inside pocket. The house had grown quiet, the sounds of my parents moving through the halls fading, until only the low hum of the heater remained. My body felt heavy, but my mind refused to rest. I pulled the envelope out and placed it on my lap. The thick stack of documents inside seemed to pulse with its own weight, each page a reminder that I was not crazy, not imagining things. Henry had seen me, chosen me, trusted me. I traced the edge with my thumb and felt the familiar sting in my chest. Images from the past pressed against my mind. My 25th birthday came rushing back, the one I had spent alone at the cemetery. I remembered setting down a small cake on Henry's grave, lighting a single candle, and sitting there for hours telling him about my job and how I had moved to Denver. The wind had whipped through the trees, scattering leaves across the grass, and not a single person from my family had bothered to join me. When I mentioned it later to Linda, she had smiled and said Eric was also thinking of moving there because Portland's art scene might suit him better. My words had disappeared like smoke. I leaned back against the wall, letting the memory burn and fade. Every year I had tried to believe that their neglect was unintentional, that they simply did not know how to show affection. But the evidence I now carried told me otherwise. This was never about not knowing how. It was about choice. I thought of Mark Reynolds sitting across from me in his office, his steady voice guiding me through the process. He had made me sign papers, each stroke of my pen sealing a claim I had not known I owned. When I hesitated, he had leaned forward and told me plainly that if I did not act, my parents would continue using me until there was nothing left. His certainty had steadied me then, and now his words returned like armor. I set the envelope on the nightstand, staring at it under the weak light. The urge to storm downstairs, slam it on the table, and watch their faces crumple was strong, but I forced myself to wait. Timing mattered. Tomorrow morning, when the house was bright, when they gathered to smile and exchange gifts, when the photo on the mantel glowed in the daylight, that would be the moment. I slipped the envelope back into my coat and slid beneath the covers. The sheets smelled faintly of cedar, not unpleasant, but unfamiliar. My old room would have smelled like lavender from the sachets Henry used to buy me. I closed my eyes and listened to the creaks of the house settling, the faint whistle of the wind against the windows. Sleep came in fragments. At times I drifted into shallow dreams of being small again, sitting in Henry's workshop, the scent of sawdust filling the air as he sanded a piece of wood smooth. He would hand me scraps to carve clumsy shapes and laugh when I showed him my crooked stars. Then the dream would twist, and the scraps would turn into pieces of paper with my name written across them, slipping out of my hands into Richard's and Linda's. I would wake with my heart pounding, sweat dampening my collar, Sometime after midnight, the stairs creaked and I heard soft footsteps crossing the hall. I held my breath, waiting. The steps paused outside my door, then moved toward the kitchen. A cabinet door opened, then closed, and water ran from the tap. I lay still until the silence returned, my muscles tight, as if even the house itself had grown restless with secrets. When dawn finally broke, the pale light seeping through the blinds, I pushed the covers aside and sat up with a clarity I had not felt in years. Today was New Year's Day. Today I would stop pretending. I dressed slowly, pulling on dark jeans and a navy sweater, the envelope once again secure in my pocket. Standing by the window, I watched the snow outside sparkle under the morning sunday. The neighborhood looked untouched, as if the world had been reset overnight, but inside me nothing felt new. What mattered was that soon they would see what I had carried all along. I reached for my scarf, wrapped it snugly around my neck, and whispered into the empty room. No more silence. Then I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the envelope pressing firmly against my side like a vow I would no longer break. The smell of bacon and cinnamon rolls drifted up the stairs, pulling me fully awake. I stepped into the hallway, the wooden floor cool under my socks, and made my way down toward the kitchen. Voices carried from the dining room, light and cheerful, as if nothing in the world was wrong. Richard sat at the head of the table with his phone still in hand, scrolling as usual. Linda bustled around, setting plates of eggs and waffles in front of everyone, her apron dusted with flour. Eric leaned back in his chair, telling them about a project that would send him to New York in February, his tone steady, confident, almost rehearsed. I slid into an empty seat across from him, pouring myself coffee without being asked. The steam curled up from the cup, warming my face, though my chest felt cold. Linda greeted me with her bright smile. "Morning, sweetheart. Sleep well." The living room was in clear view from where I sat, the mantel shining with its polished frame, the photo glaring back at me with its hollow space where my face had once been. The sight steeled me. I sipped my coffee and let the warmth settle in my hands before setting the cup down. Breakfast carried on with Eric filling every pause. He spoke about the design firm in Los Angeles, how impressed they were, how international clients were reaching out. Linda glowed at every word, her eyes sparkling. Richard murmured approval, occasionally lifting his glass of juice. I kept quiet, listening, my fingers brushing against the envelope tucked safely in my coat pocket, draped over the back of my chair. When the plates were nearly empty and Linda started clearing dishes, I reached for the envelope. My hands didn't tremble. I set it gently on the center of the table, the cream paper stark against the checkered cloth. Richard glanced up briefly, uninterested, until I spoke. "This is for you," I said evenly. "A gift for the new year." Linda looked at it curiously. "You did not need to get us anything. Just having you here is enough." I forced a faint smile. "I want you to have it, but please do not open it yet." For a brief moment no one moved. Eric was too busy scrolling through his phone, tapping replies. Linda reached out her fingers, brushing the edge of the envelope, her curiosity already winning. She turned it over in her hands, eyes narrowing slightly at the red legal seal stamped on the back. Richard set his phone down at last, his brow furrowing. "What is this, Claire?" "You will see," I replied softly, my voice steady, though my heart thudded against my ribs. Linda's lips pressed into a thin line as she carefully tore the flap open. Papers slid out onto the table, the weight of them surprising her. She unfolded the first sheet and scanned it quickly, her face draining of color. Richard leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he read over her shoulder. The room grew still. Even the faint hum of the heater seemed to disappear. Linda's hands shook slightly as she flipped to the next page, her mouth parting in disbelief. Richard's jaw tightened, a sheen of sweat forming near his hairline. "What is this?" Linda whispered, her voice lower, now almost broken. The silence around us pressed heavy, the only sound the rustle of paper as Richard gripped the stack and flipped through each sheet, his eyes moving faster, his breath sharp. Eric finally glanced up from his phone, noticing the change in the room. He frowned. "What is going on?" Richard dropped the papers back onto the table, the edges splaying across the cloth. He looked at me, his eyes hard, searching for something to hold on to. "The truth," I said, simply keeping my voice calm. Eric leaned forward, confused. "Truth about what?" I met his gaze briefly, then returned mine to Richard and Linda. "You will all know soon enough." No one spoke after that. Linda sat back slowly, her hands still pressed to the pile of documents. Richard rubbed his temple, his shoulders tense, his jaw locked. Eric's eyes darted between us, unsettled. I lifted my coffee again, taking a long sip, the bitterness grounding me. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, lighting the table, glinting off the polished Rolex on Eric's wrist. I set my cup down, gently waiting. The shift I had carried inside me for months was now alive in the room, pressing against all of us, undeniable. Linda finally broke the silence with a shaky laugh that sounded nothing like joy. "Claire, I am not sure I understand." Richard did not echo her. He only sat there staring at me as if weighing his next move. The papers lay between us like a chasm wide and unbridgeable. I leaned back in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, and let the silence stretch. It was not my turn to explain. Not anymore. Linda's hands hovered over the stack of papers as if touching them might burn her. Her lips moved, but no words came out, just a faint tremor that made the lines around her mouth deepen. Richard was the first to find his voice, his tone sharp and brittle. "Where did you get this?" I kept my gaze steady. "From the county office. They gave me certified copies of the will and the property records. It is all there. Grandpa left the house on Brookfield Street to me directly. No conditions, no middlemen." Richard's face reddened, a vein pulsing at his temple. "You do not understand what was happening then. You were still in school. You were not in any position to manage a property." My voice was low but firm. "That was never your decision to make. It was mine." Eric leaned forward, confusion flickering across his features. "Wait, what house?" I turned to him, my words cutting through the room. "The triplex you used for your photo shoot last fall. The one with the red door near Creekside Park. That house is mine. It has been mine since 2016. Eric blinked, his mouth opening and closing. "You mean all this time?" "Yes," I said evenly. "All this time, Mom and Dad have been collecting the rent money. They raised the rent twice, signed lease agreements, took vacations with it, paid for your tuition. While I worked 2 jobs just to buy my books, they were living off what belonged to me." Linda finally found her voice weak and trembling. "We did not mean to keep it from you. Things were complicated. You were so young and Eric needed support. We thought we were keeping things stable." I leaned forward slightly, my voice sharper now. "No one asked me. No one told me. I was old enough to know I was eating cold sandwiches and living on instant noodles. I was old enough to ask for help. You just decided I did not deserve to know." Richard slammed his palm on the table, the sound echoing through the dining room. "You were always the strong one. You never needed anything. Eric needed more." I stared at him, my chest tight, but my words clear. Being strong does not mean being invisible. Not needing help does not mean being used. Eric pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. "You kept this from me too," he said, his eyes wide, looking at Richard and Linda. "I never knew any of this." Richard's voice softened, almost pleading. "We did it for the family, to keep us together." I shook my head slowly. "No, you did it to keep me small." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that left no space for excuses. Linda's hands covered her mouth, her eyes glassy, while Richard stared at the papers with a mixture of fury and fear. Eric stood frozen, his watch glinting in the morning light, his confidence cracked. I pulled out one more sheet from the envelope, sliding it across the table. "This is the confirmation from the registry. As of last month, all leases have been updated. From now on, the tenants pay me directly. You no longer have access." Richard's face drained of color. "By doing this, you are destroying everything we built." A laugh escaped me, quiet but edged. "No, Dad. I am just taking back what was already mine." Linda reached across the table, her voice hurried, desperate. "You cannot do this to your family." I looked straight at her, steady and cold. Family does not erase you from photographs. Family does not steal what belongs to you and pretend it never existed. Her hand dropped back, trembling. Eric looked between us, searching for some footing. I did not know, he repeated, softer this time, almost to himself. Richard leaned back, gripping his glass of juice so hard I thought it might shatter. His voice was low, rough. You will regret this, Claire. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. No, I said. The only thing I regret is letting it go on this long. The room stayed silent as I slid the remaining documents back into the envelope. The fire in the living room crackled faintly, the only sound that dared to move. Linda's eyes followed me, pleading but empty. Richard stared at the table as if the papers might vanish if he glared hard enough. Eric shifted on his feet, lost. I tucked the envelope back into my coat and let the weight of it press against my side. For the first time, it did not feel like a burden. It felt like truth. I walked toward the doorway, without another word, the air behind me thick with everything left unsaid. Linda's chair scraped across the floor as she stood, her hands reaching toward me. Claire, please wait. We can talk about this. We can find a way to fix it. Her voice cracked, the cheerfulness she had carried all weekend gone like smoke. Richard pushed his glass aside and rose slowly, his shoulders squared as if bracing for battle. You are making a mistake. You think cutting us out will make you happy, but you are destroying this family. I turned to face him, my coat already in my hands. This family destroyed itself the day you decided I did not count. His jaw tightened. You have no idea what we sacrificed to keep things going. I almost laughed. Sacrifice. While I borrowed money for textbooks and worked overnight shifts, you collected rent checks in my name. You took vacations. You bought Eric his first studio. Do not talk to me about sacrifice. Eric stood to the side, his face pale. He shifted uneasily, eyes darting between all of us. I really did not know, he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Linda moved closer, her voice trembling now. We never meant to hurt you. We thought you were stronger, that you could handle yourself. Eric needed us. You would always find your way. I looked at her, my chest hollow. Being strong does not mean being forgotten. Richard's hand slammed against the table, the papers jumping from the impact. Enough. You are not walking out like this. You owe us a conversation. I slipped on my coat, the envelope pressing firm against my ribs. No, I do not owe you anything. Eric's voice broke through the tension, sharp and panicked. What happens now? What are you going to do with the house? I met his eyes steady. I already did what I had to. The tenants know the truth. From now on, they deal with me directly. His mouth opened, but no words came. Linda's hands trembled at her sides. Richard glared at me with a fury that could have cracked stone. The silence pressed so hard I could hear my own heartbeat. I picked up my bag from the floor, slinging it over my shoulder. Linda's voice chased me to the door, desperate, thin. Claire, you cannot just leave. We are family. I turned back for one last look. Family is supposed to protect you, not erase you. Richard took a step forward, but I was already pulling the door open. Cold air rushed in, stinging my face. Behind me, Eric called out, his voice sharp with bitterness. You think you are better than us now? I paused on the porch, the snow crunching under my boots, and glanced back through the doorway. No, I said quietly. I just know I am not beneath you anymore. The door closed behind me with a heavy thud, muffling whatever words followed. I stepped into the winter air, the neighborhood still and quiet, except for the sound of snow falling softly onto the ground. My breath came out in clouds, but my chest felt lighter than it had in years. I walked down the driveway, each step cutting clean tracks in the fresh snow. The envelope was safe. The truth was mine, and for the first time I was not carrying their silence. I was carrying my own. The morning sun broke weakly through the clouds, glinting on the frozen branches of the maple trees lining the street. My boots crunched steady against the sidewalk as I moved farther from the house that had never truly been home. I did not look back again. 2 weeks later, I was back in Denver, standing in my kitchen, pouring coffee, when my phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with Linda's name, her message short and urgent. "Your father and I just got a notice from the bank. We need to talk." I stared at it until the screen dimmed, then slid the phone face down without answering. By the end of that week, another message appeared, this time from a number I recognized instantly. Richard's words were clipped and formal. "We should sit down like adults. You do not want to tear this family apart." I set the phone aside and let the silence stretch. 7 years of silence from them could not be erased by one line pleading for civility. News traveled quickly in Sacramento. An old friend from high school sent me a picture of the condo Linda had once boasted about. A handwritten sign was taped to the glass door. "For sale by owner, must sell quickly." The elegant curtains, I remembered, were drawn halfway, the balcony empty, where potted plants once Saturday. The image gave me no thrill, only a quiet recognition. Without the rent money flowing from Brookfield Street, they could not keep both homes afloat. Richard had retired years ago. Linda worked part-time at a flower shop. They had built their life on something that was never theirs, and now the foundation had crumbled. Eric's fall came even faster. He had bragged about his Los Angeles studio, the one where he hosted clients with wine and playlists, claiming it was his creative haven. By February, his messages grew frantic. He said he had been locked out for missing payments, that no one would extend him more credit. One line read, "Mom says, you will not help. Are you really going to ignore me?" I locked my screen and set it aside. Friends back home told me Eric had moved back in with Richard and Linda. The three of them were crammed into the small house in Fremont, the same one Linda once dismissed as too cramped for big dreams. They no longer mentioned galleries or overseas projects. The neighbors saw Eric at the grocery store, looking worn out, no watch on his wrist, no shine in his step. Meanwhile, I was learning what it meant to breathe without weight pressing on me. I moved into the second floor of the Brookfield house, the room Henry had once used as a study. The window overlooked the park, and in the mornings I listened to sparrows while the light spilled across the curtains. The tenants downstairs greeted me warmly. One afternoon, Brian from the ground floor knocked on my door with tears in his eyes after I announced a 10% rent reduction. He hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, whispering that I was the first landlord who treated them like people. Another tenant, Natalie, a young nurse who worked night shifts, left a thank you card on my step. She wrote that my decision had given her enough room in her budget to start saving again. Holding that card in my hands felt like a gift I had never once received under my parents' tree. The house itself carried Henry's spirit. I hired a crew to repair the roof, repaint the fence, and sand the old wooden frames. Each nail hammered, each brush of paint felt like stitching a wound shut. One afternoon, as I watered the plants on the porch, Alice Green walked over with a bouquet of daisies. She smiled gently and said, "Your grandfather would be proud. You brought this place back to life." I held the flowers close, my throat tightening. Not everyone knew the full story, but that did not matter. She had seen enough. While my life quieted, theirs unraveled in small humiliations. A neighbor told me Richard had been seen at the bank arguing with a teller, his voice raised, his hands shaking. Linda had stopped by the flower shop less often, her smile brittle, her hair unkempt. Eric posted nothing on social media anymore. The last picture before silence was of him standing in front of a mural, smiling, the Rolex catching the light. Weeks later, people whispered he had sold it. I did not gloat. I did not send messages to remind them of what they had done. I only carried on, waking early, going to work at Frontline Logistics, coming home to a place that finally felt like mine. The silence was enough. One evening in March, I sat at my desk in the study, a stack of bills neatly organized, when an email from Linda appeared. The subject line read simply, "Family." I opened it slowly, my chest tight. Her words spilled across the screen. "Claire, I know you are angry, but you cannot let this one thing ruin everything. We are family. Ryan is struggling. Your father has not slept in weeks. I know I was wrong, but please think it over. Families should not fall apart over one house. I stared at the line until the words blurred. One house. I thought of every night I lay in a freezing dorm room with no blanket thick enough. I thought of the times I had to choose between gas and food, the times I worked double shifts and still came up short. I thought of the years they cashed rent checks in my name while telling me to be grateful for a mug that said special daughter. One house, she wrote, as if it were small, as if it were not the proof of everything they had stolen. I closed the email without replying. The silence felt louder than any words I could have sent. The house around me was quiet, the tenants settling in for the night, the streetlights casting soft pools of light across the snow. I sat back in the navy armchair I had bought to replace Henry's old one, the keys to the house resting on the table beside me. The thought came slowly but firmly. They could live with their choices. I was finally living with mine. Spring came early that year, the snow melting into soft patches of grass by the first week of April. The maple tree in the front yard of Brookfield Street was already budding its small green leaves reaching toward the Sunday. I spent Saturdays outside with a shovel in hand clearing out the garden bed Henry once tended. My hands ached, dirt clung under my nails, but the work steadied me. Every time I pressed the soil flat, I felt closer to the life I had chosen. Inside, the tenants carried on with their routines. Brian waved each morning as he headed to the construction site. Natalie left notes when she worked late shifts at the hospital, her handwriting small but careful. Even the elderly couple on the third floor brought down a plate of cookies now and then. These small exchanges filled the silence in a way my family never had. They reminded me that connection was possible without conditions, without shadows of comparison. One Saturday, I asked my friend Elise to bring her camera. She stood across the street and laughed as I posed awkwardly in front of the house. I wore an old khaki coat, my hair pulled back loosely, a ring of keys hanging from my hand. The freshly painted mahogany door framed me, the white fence bright behind it. Elise snapped a few pictures, and I chose one that felt the most like me. Later that week, I had it printed and placed in a dark wood frame. I hung it in the hallway outside my room, right where the light caught it each morning. For once I was in the photo and no one could cut me out. The days slipped into a rhythm I had never known before. I went to work at Frontline. Logistics came home in the evenings, sometimes cooked simple meals or sat in Henry's old reading nook with tea and a book. On Sundays, I walked the dog I had recently adopted, a gentle brown mutt, from the shelter through the park across the street. Life was not dramatic, not filled with applause or gifts, but it was mine. That was enough. One afternoon, while watering plants on the porch, I received a small envelope with no return address. The handwriting was unmistakable. Inside was a faded photograph of me and Henry standing at the wooden table in the backyard. I must have been 12. His hand rested on my shoulder, both of us smiling as the sun fell across us. Below it, in Linda's careful script, were just a few words. "We did not know how to hold on to you. I hope you hold on to yourself." I folded the card and placed it in the desk drawer next to the old letter Henry had written when I graduated high school. I did not cry, and I did not feel bitterness. It was not an apology, but it was something, and it did not matter whether it was enough. I already knew how to hold on to myself. That summer, I invited a few close friends over for dinner in the backyard. We strung fairy lights in the maple tree, grilled food on a small barbecue, and played soft jazz on a speaker. Laughter filled the air, steady and genuine, and for the first time in years, I felt joy without the heaviness of waiting for someone else to give it to me. Marcus, a photographer friend, looked around as the evening settled. "This place has good energy," he said. "Not the kind of fancy you show off, but the kind that makes you want to stay." I smiled and looked at the porch where the lights shimmered against the fresh paint. Because it does not ask anyone to pretend. Later that night, as I stood by the window, I thought of Henry. I imagined him sitting in his armchair, a book in his lap, his quiet presence filling the room. Maybe this was what I had really inherited from him. Not just a house, but the right to build a life without begging to be seen. I knew then that I was no longer the girl waiting at the edge of a family table, hoping for a question, a gift, a a glance. I was no longer the missing face in a photograph. Now I was the only one in the frame, and I was enough. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is walk away from places that no longer love us, not to get even but to reclaim our worth. I no longer wait for validation from those who erased me. Instead, I live truthfully piece by piece, building something steady and real. What about you? If you were in my place, would you have walked away too or tried to forgive? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if stories of family betrayal and finding your strength speak to you, make sure to stay with this channel. There are more stories to come, stories that remind us we are not alone in choosing ourselves.